If you're wondering why there's already writing on the screen, because we're in part 2 of our 2-part series on slope. So if you're confused about what slope is, go back and watch the first video. In this video, we're going to talk about different types of lines, right? Different types of slopes. And we're going to talk about parallel lines and perpendicular lines as they pertain to slope. So let's get started. Last time we talked about slope as the direction and steepness of a line, right? Direction being positive or negative, and steepness being that number associated with our line. So sometimes we'll actually get a slope that's undefined, right? We don't have a way to talk about that. And why would that happen? Well, remember, slope is the change in y over the change in x. And because these are just numbers, right? Sometimes you'll have a number up here for your change in y, but you won't have a number for your change in x, right? You'll get zero change in x. What does that look like? Well, if this is y and x, that looks like a vertical line. Right, you can see here we're changing in y all over the place, up and down. But for x, there is no change. I'm not moving anywhere horizontally. So dividing by 0 is undefined. It's an undefined slope. Another way to talk about undefined slope is it's a vertical line. Just to be clear on that, right? So undefined slope is when we have 0 change in x, and it looks like a vertical line. Okay, what about zero slope? Well, just like last time, sometimes you'll have 0 change in y, and you'll have some change in x. Maybe before I draw it, what do you think that might look like? What do you think a zero slope? If you said a horizontal line, you would be correct, right? No change in y. It's horizontal, but there's change in x all over the place. So a zero slope is a horizontal line. So those are two kind of special types of slopes, right? That don't fall into our normal categories. Now let's talk about multiple lines, right? Different lines, parallel lines, and perpendicular lines. So we've got two lines, parallel lines. Now, what do you know about parallel lines? Maybe you've heard them compared to railroad tracks, right? They never cross. If I'm teaching in a class, I would look up at the ceiling and point to the tiles, right? And how those straight lines, they never touch each other. So parallel lines are just two lines that never cross, right? And if I were to draw these lines as long as I possibly could, they would never ever cross, right? Because remember, a line extends on forever. So this isn't a parallel line segment. No, it's a parallel line. And how do you know they'll never cross? Well, parallel lines, this is the important bit. This is kind of what we're talking about. Parallel lines have the same slope. They have the same slope. That's really important to remember. That parallel lines have the same slope. Okay, what about perpendicular lines? Well, perpendicular lines, I think it's worth maybe saying, what does perpendicular mean? Perpendicular lines, they intersect at a right angle. That's what it means to be perpendicular, is to meet at a right angle. Okay, so what does that look like? Well, if we have a graph here, y and x, great. Perpendicular lines, if I were to give you a line, I don't know, here, I think right here, a perpendicular line would come across and intersect at a right angle, just like that. Okay, so that's a perpendicular line. Now, how do we figure out what the slope of these lines are? Let's say I give you the slope of this line right here. How could you know what the slope of that line is? Well, perpendicular lines, they have opposite reciprocal slopes. They have opposite reciprocal slopes. Now, what does that mean? Well, let's say I give you this line right here. Let's say it has a slope of -2/3. Okay? And we want to find what the slope of a perpendicular line is. Perpendicular, we draw that symbol like this. That's perpendicular. So if we want to find the perpendicular line, I'm kind of drawing an arrow to show that we're finding the line perpendicular to a line with a slope of -2/3. We take the opposite of -2/3, which is +2/3, and the reciprocal, which is that fraction flipped. So the opposite reciprocal would be +3/2. And that would be the slope of the line perpendicular. Sometimes that feels kind of abstract, so let's look at a couple of examples to talk about parallel lines and talk about perpendicular lines. Okay, again, there's writing on here because we used this last time. Last time we found that the slope of EF was -1/2. Okay, so if the slope of EF is -1/2, we can box that. Better box than that. Go all the way around it. Okay, if the slope of EF is -1/2, what would the slope of a line parallel to EF be? Well, hopefully you're thinking it's the same, right? It's going to be the same slope. It would be -1/2. Okay, what would that look like on a graph? Let's just pick a point up here that we can see. Why not? And -1/2 is down 1/2. And we'll go, that's pretty good. Okay, so now if we were to draw that out as a line, boom. Well, a little off. There we go. Right, you can see those lines, they're not intersecting. And even if we extended them on forever, they would never intersect. So that's a line parallel. What about a line perpendicular? Well, remember, perpendicular lines, that's the opposite. Oops. That's the opposite reciprocal. So if I have -1/2, finding the line that's perpendicular to that, the opposite is +1/2, and the reciprocal is 2/1. And 2/1 is 2. Pretty cool, right? So the opposite reciprocal is 2. And what would that look like? Well, again, let's pick a point. Could be any point, but I'll pick this point right here. If we go up 2/1, right, rise over run, down here just to kind of get the whole picture. And we drew a line. It's not perfect, but as you'll see, that looks pretty good in my opinion, my humble opinion. And that we have right angles. Oops. We have right angles right here and on the parallel line, right? On both of those lines because they have the same slope. So the line that's perpendicular to one is perpendicular to the other, which is pretty cool. Okay, so big ideas. Undefined slope, straight line up and down. Zero slope, a straight line horizontally. Slope of parallel lines is the same, and the slope of perpendicular lines are opposite reciprocals. Okay, we've actually got one more video on slope. We'll do a quick example, but that should hopefully give you a good picture of slope, what it is, and how we use it.